Hi, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Good evening. My name is Jacob Padron. I'm the artistic director of Longworth Theater, and I'm so happy to be in this virtual space with all of you. I want to begin by acknowledging the land that I'm calling in from. I'm calling in from as you can see, I'm in my apartment in New Haven, and it is the land of the Quinnipiac, the Wappinger, and the Pagasit. I want to invite all of you who are watching, actually, we're going to drop a link in the chat where you can share with us where you're calling in from and whose native land you are on. And that'll be in the chat in just a bit. So welcome to All Rise, our conversation about the incredible impact and legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I want to start by just also doing some staff thanks. So the first is to just thank the entire Longworth Theater staff. They really do make all of our work possible. So shout out to Longworth Theater staff. Thank you so much for your continued dedication, all that you do to make the work of Longworth Theater possible. I also want to acknowledge my partner in crime, Managing Director Kit Ingley. Thank you, Kit. Also to our line producer for this evening's event, Emily Goller. Emily, thank you so much. Appreciate you. And to our board, many of whom I hope are watching from home. So this event tonight, this panel is a part of our continued season that we are calling One City, Many Stages. When COVID-19 hit, we knew that we had to pivot. We had to come up with an emergent, adaptive, responsive season. We felt like this was an opportunity to really be in conversation with our community, with our artists, with our audiences in a different kind of way. So the way that we're trying to stay connected is mainly through a virtual space. And we're trying to be responsive to the world that we live in right now, right? Global pandemic, the demands for racial justice. There is a lot going on. The world is on fire, and the theater can be a space that can hold all kinds of stories. The theater can be a space that brings us together in community to wrestle with these big ideas. And so with the passing of RBG, we felt like this was the right time and just such the right opportunity to hold space to talk about her legacy and her impact, especially in a community where there is actually so much activism and all of us working together to try to actually make the world better. So I'm really happy. We have a great panel lined up for you tonight. It's really extraordinary. We did this in partnership with SCOTUS Theater. They are a San Francisco-based company. My dear friend, Lisa Stern, is the co-founder of that, and she will be moderating tonight's conversation. I'm going to let Lisa talk a little bit more about the panelists and share their amazing work. But I want to talk to you first about Lisa and where she comes from. So here's a little bit more about Lisa. So Lisa Stern is the co-artistic director of SCOTUS Theater. SCOTUS Theater, which began in 2016, brings together communities of artists, activists, and concerned individuals to hear and consider Supreme Court cases for ourselves. SCOTUS Theater is Lisa's side passion. Her main work is as a nurse practitioner and policy advocate in sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. She is currently senior advisor at the Coalition to Expand Contraceptive Access. So Lisa, thank you so much for being here. And I am going to turn it over to you and the panelists. Thank you.
Jacob, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. Thank you to Long Wharf. As Jacob said, I'm Lisa Stern from SCOTUS Theater and used to live in New Haven, so it's really exciting to return to those roots. We have a wonderful group of panelists today who will help guide us through some discussion of Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory and honor and interrogate her legacy in American justice. Please feel free to make comments throughout. We'll take audience questions mostly at the end, but feel free to write anything in the chat when it comes up, and we'll make sure that that we get to address your concerns and questions as well. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our panelists, and then I will invite them on screen. So we have two local New Haven experts. So we're joined today by Kevin Barry, who is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at Quinnipiac University Law School, and the co-director of the law school's Civil Justice Clinic, which represents low-income clients through a combination of direct legal services and policy advocacy. And Kevin's scholarship and litigation focuses on civil and human rights issues, including transgender rights and disability rights. Judith Resnick, also a local New Haven expert, is the Arthur Lyman Professor of Law at Yale Law School and a founding director of the Lyman Center for Public Interest Law. She teaches a variety of courses. She's truly an expert on the courts and systems, and chairs Yale Law School's Global Constitutional Law Seminar. In addition to her distinguished academic record, Judith also, like SCOTUS Theater, enjoys to be at the intersection of the arts and the law, and once played a lawyer opposite Ruth Bader Ginsberg at a judicial conference. So she's a natural to join us. Our other two panelists, who you'll meet shortly, are not New Havenites, but nonetheless wonderful experts to be part of this and have been with SCOTUS Theater before. Imani Gandhi is Senior Editor of Law and Policy at Rewire News, where she covers law and the courts, and also is the host of the Boom Lawyered podcast, which I highly recommend for those who have an interest in these topics. Imani also pens the award-winning Angry Black Lady Chronicles blog, and is also really one of the best people that you could follow on Twitter. And last but not least, Cindy Suhu is Professor of Law and co-director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at the City University of New York Law School. And her work emphasizes intersectional identities and barriers to reproductive health and abortion services. And Cindy's authored numerous submissions to the U.S. Supreme Court, appellate courts, and international forums on these topics. So I'm excited to invite all of our panelists into the virtual room, and we'll get started. Great. Thank you all for joining us. My first question is just about your own connections to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Do you remember when you first heard of her, a first thing that you read? Just what brought her onto your radar? What's your recollection? And Cindy, I'll let you lead things off for us.
Sure. It's funny. I was trying to remember when I first, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg first came on my radar screen. And I think it was actually in 1993 when she was nominated to join the Supreme Court. And it's funny, at the time, I actually was 1 year out of law school. And I remember seeing these images of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And at the time, I think she had been on the DC Circuit Court for 13 years, and she really came across as this moderate justice, and I think Clinton was sort of pushing her as a judge's judge, right, who had voted with Bork 85% of the time or something like that, right? But then you kind of knew in the background that she had this whole history with the ACLU, right, starting the Women's Rights Project and arguing, important cases before the Supreme Court. And then she had also sort of given a speech where she was critical of Roe. And so I think people were kind of we didn't really know, what to make of her, right? And then I think she came across my radar screen again when I was at Columbia and I was running a program looking at human rights and the United States. And Justice Ginsburg had written some great decisions in Grutter and Gratz, which were the Supreme Court cases on affirmative action. And at the time, the Supreme Court was sort of moving away from quotas and race-conscious remedies. And Justice Ginsburg actually quoted international law and talked about the fact that we need to be thinking about context, right? It's not just about whether or not a system uses race and whether it's race-conscious, but what's the purpose, right? And what I really appreciated about those decisions was her thinking about substantive equality, right? It matters actually how this provision is going to play out in the real world. It matters if a race-conscious provision is really going to promote equality, is the purpose of it to promote equality and address past discrimination or not. And so that's what I remember about her at, when she first came across my radar screen. And then as I started to do more reproductive justice work, I just fell in love with her. But I also want to say that one thing about her and her commitment to international law, I think at the time, and I know Judith knows so much more on this, but I remember that she and Justice O'Connor got death threats at the time, because this idea that you would actually look at international law was so frightening. And it was interesting also that it was the two women justices, right, who got these death threats.
Yeah. Wow. Cindy, thank you for setting us up so clearly with such a rich background. Imani, how about you? Was it also 93 when RBG came across your radar? What's your recollection?
I think it probably would have been when I took my first con law class in college. So 1992, when we started studying Reed v. Reed. I think that was sort of when I was, because at the time I thought I was going to be a classical clarinetist, because that's what I did all through high school. And so I took my first con law class, and I think it was the discussion of Reed, the discussion of Bakke, and then the discussion of Bowers v. Hardwick that made me think, maybe I should go to law school. So yeah, that was a sort of formative time for me. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a lot to do with the reason that I decided to abandon a life of classical music and go to law school. So, and then like Cindy, I spent 13 years in private practice doing insurance work. And then when I became more avid about reproductive rights and reproductive justice around 2011, that's when I really started to dig into some of her opinions, especially her opinions on abortion rights and her opinions on equal pay and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's sort of my track with her.
Great, thank you. Although I have to say, maybe you'll play clarinet later.
Oh God, I will absolutely not.
Some other form of entertainment is hard to pass it up. Kevin, how about you?
Yeah, so I wonder if Imani and I might be around the same age. So I was in college, graduated in 93. So went to law school. Graduated college 97. Went to law school in the late 90s. And this was really before RBG, Justice Ginsburg, was an icon. So this was, 4 years. I think Cindy told me that's 4 years before she joined the Supreme Court. This was about, incidentally, 3 years before her namesake, Notorious B.I.G., released his debut album. So I'm in law school, and I really wasn't paying all that much attention to really any of the justices, for that matter. This was also before these interesting things appeared on an iPhone. My RBG was Thurgood Marshall, who had passed away earlier in the early 90s, and kind of one of my influences going to law school. But I started paying attention to Justice Ginsburg when I began doing disability rights work. And I was doing this in the 2000s. And she authored an amazing decision in 1999 called Olmstead versus LC. And that decision was, in essence, the Brown versus Board of Education for people with intellectual disabilities, in particular the plaintiffs. In those cases, two women with intellectual disabilities, one with a mental illness. And so that decision said that it was discrimination to institutionalize people with intellectual disabilities, to keep them separate from the rest of the community when they can benefit from community placement. And that is still good law. And it's a big deal to the disability rights movement. So I first started paying attention to her then. Shame on me for not doing it earlier. But I will say, just to kind of finish this piece off, what I love about the fact that Justice Ginsburg has this iconic status is that now she's not just one of my heroes, but she's also my daughter's hero. So my daughter's 11 years old. So she knows Justice Ginsburg by name, by appearance. She saw the documentary with me. She's read the children's book. And I think this is not only awesome as a parent, but I think it's also important, because when we make icons of some of these folks, we make more of them. So I'm no Thurgood Marshall, but he was one of the reasons I went to law school. And I do think that we're going to have more or following in the footsteps of Justice Ginsburg. And I think we need more. I think we need 9 more, or maybe 10 or 11, but we'll get to that part of the talk later.
This will reform soon enough. Appreciate that, Kevin. Thank you. Judith, I saved you for last because I know you had a really rich relationship with the justice. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, hi, and this is obviously an intergenerational conversation. Lovely that you invoked your daughter. And I would have first met her either as a law student at NYU involved with the ACLU, or soon thereafter when she was a law professor. And then I knew her when she was on the DC Court of Appeals before going to the Supreme Court. So there was groups of women law professors who would collect in various ways. There's an organization called the National Association of Women Judges and one called the International Association of Women Judges. I'm involved in each. And when she was still on the DC circuit, there was a conference in Washington of the National Association of Women Judges, and she convened a panel for the hundreds of people on feminist jurisprudence. And I was one of several speakers. We all went home to dinner that night at her home, where her husband, Marty Ginsburg, a very famous chef from there's a cookbook at the Supreme Court you can buy of his recipes, and he cooked for us all. And half a dozen of us realized that each of us, they were all women, had spouses who cooked better than we did, which I think was an example of how nurturing all of our spouses were and how important partnerships of various kinds. People are in all different kinds of family configurations. This is no means a story about any singular kind, but rather that in support of households of all kinds, having co-workers will join you was totally important. And so then, of course, I think we should think of her as everybody's resiliency coach when we're speaking about looking forward as well as past. I remember getting a letter from her when she was facing in the early 2000s, a round of chemotherapy, saying she knew she could manage it amidst everything else she was doing. And one of the things that was great about her is that she showed you, not personal you, all of us, I have a slight thumb problem, showed all of us that you could be a worker, a member of a household, a parent, a spouse, related to people, friend, as well as a person who isn't always fully feeling well, everybody has abilities and disabilities of all kinds, and continue to move forward in a straightforward, uncomplaining way. And I think my spouse, Danny Curtis, who also knew her, we knew them, said, in addition to being an icon, she was a really nice person. At a very one-on-one level, I mentioned as we were gathering, I know of scores of people that she reached out to help or that asked some of us to help, and none of it was instrumental. It wasn't to make something for her, it was to make the world better for all of us.
That's incredibly inspiring. And I think it's always a nice reminder that even people who don't achieve the level of fame or notoriety that Justice Ginsburg did can have that kind of legacy. It also really reminds me, one of the things that I found most moving in watching documentaries about her life was that she didn't seek this level of notoriety, that in a way it was almost hard for her as a shy person to have that kind of prominence and icon status, as Kevin mentioned. I want to go back to kind of the beginning. And Cindy, you mentioned that, before Justice Ginsburg was a judge and before she made it to the court, that a lot of her, renown in the legal field came from her work at ACLU. And I was thinking so much about, that lots of people have a lot of passion for a cause, right? And really care about it. And not that many people are able to have the level of impact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did on gender justice and women's rights. And I was wondering if you all, as legal scholars, could help those of us who are not understand just what was so ingenious, what was so timely. And I know, Imani, you alluded to Read v. Read. This may be relevant. Just what was so particularly effective about the way that Ruth Bader Ginsburg went about this work?
Maybe should I start and then other people can chime in? As a clinical professor, it's interesting to think about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did and why she's so successful. And I think it's important to think about how many different roles she had over time, right? And over a long period of time, and how she was a trailblazer and she really exemplified excellence in all of those roles, right? So thinking about, she was the first she was one of 5 people at Harvard Law School in the 50s. And then by the 70s, she was the first tenured professor at Columbia, started the Women's Rights Project. And, as a litigator, I think she was successful because she was strategic, right? She had a long-term plan about how she was going to build constitutional protections. And it's kind of amazing, right, for us now to think about that that the Constitution didn't prohibit gender-based discrimination at the time, right? And she was going to, be one of the architects of creating that. And I think she looked at the laws that she wanted to dismantle, and then she was an incrementalist and a tactician, right? And she thought about like what would actually convince decision makers, right? So she made decisions about bringing cases on behalf of male plaintiffs, right? How can you actually convince an all-male bench, right? Because the bench is all male. And then, then she became a judge. And I think as a judge, she consolidated the work that she did, but really thought about building consensus and writing carefully crafted decisions. And then, the ground shifted on her, right? In terms of the Supreme Court becoming more conservative and her becoming a dissenter. But I think, what's interesting is just that she's strategic and she's thinking about how to be the best in the roles that she has, and that changed over time.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh into this?
Maybe I should one is to just add that she was very serious about building community and coalition. She worked very closely with Pauli Murray on the brief that is one of her what has become famous, rightly so, is she authored a brief in a case called the Reed v. Reed case that's been mentioned. Idaho had a statute that said that if a child dies, the father must, M-U-S-T, be the executor of the estate. And in this very sad family that she connected to, the mother and father had been divorced and the son was terribly troubled. And when he died, Sally Reed said, wait a second, the statutory preference is a problem. The interesting thing from lawyers' point of view is if you go back and read her brief, first of all, it's breathtaking in that it incites cases from Germany from 49 and it cites cases from, it's an international and domestic brief. It's got de Tocqueville and it's got Simone de Beauvoir and it's got all kinds of levels of theory and sociology, setting forth how archaic would be a statutory presumption that you always trigger for a man as compared to a woman, father versus mother. So it was anti-stereotyping at the get-go. If you read the US Supreme Court opinion, in contrast, written by Chief Justice Berger, there's a couple paragraphs in the brief is never mentioned, but it says you can't discriminate on the account of sex in this way. So it's this huge breakthrough. And here she is having scoped out the world and brought to the court unabashedly. And here on the tactician's part, this was not a conservative brief. This was an out there brief telling how Neanderthal the law of the United States was and persuading, but from the decision, you don't know that she's the underbelly of it. That's the first piece of it. The second is, as a law professor, she pioneered in the American Association of Law Schools, the correct Cindy's reference to the all-male bench, try the all-male professoriate and a lot more all-male. And she and Herman Hill Kay co-founded the section for women on legal education of the American Association of Law Schools, a thing that continues first. And she started that sense that women need to work together in community, cross race, class, to work together. And then the other is that she saw, coming back to the point about substantive equality, that the issue was not just formally who gets the statutory name, but actually what does it mean in practice? And here on the screen is a case that is less high visible called MLB. A woman lost her status in Mississippi. She was told she's no longer the mother of this child. And she sought to appeal, and the grounds to appeal, she needed the transcript of the trial record. And to get the trial transcript, she needed more than $2,000, and she didn't have it. The case is presented to the US Supreme Court because the Mississippi Supreme Court says, sorry, nothing in our statutes lets the state pay when a person is too poor to afford to appeal. And Justice Ginsburg wrote this incredibly important decision saying, it can't be that the state can end your parental status on the grounds of a single judge calling the balls and strikes or whatever the metaphor would be, and instead said you have to provide, in a very narrow set of cases, access for civil litigants to get to the appellate court. And on remand, it turns out that the case was reversed and the woman did not lose all relationship to her child and got visiting rights as well. So, and Ginsburg always would talk to you about what happened afterwards. It wasn't just what's it say on the paper. It's what matters in human beings' lives.
Great. Kevin?
Terrific. Well, these are tough acts to follow. What struck me, and some of there's language in one of Justice Ginsburg's opinions. So the U.S. versus Virginia, fairly famous case. I think it's in her documentary. This is from 1996. But I went right to it in a brief that I worked on. And she's got these, this was the decision, by the way, that struck down a men's only requirement for this Virginia military school under the Equal Protection Clause. It said you can't do this. You have not shown, the opinion read in this exceedingly persuasive justification for excluding women from this very prestigious military school. In the last paragraph there, she's got this great quote. She says, "A prime part of the history of our Constitution is the story of the extension of constitutional rights and protections to people once ignored or excluded." And she goes on and says, "There's no reason to believe that the admission of women capable of all the activities required of these military cadets would destroy the Institute rather than enhance its capacity to serve, quote, the more perfect union." Okay, so she's drawing that language from the Constitution itself. So women will improve this union. And so I got to thinking about this paragraph. Well, I love it because of the result in the case. We, in essence, have, thanks to Justice Ginsburg, and I'm writing from the majority, women's participation in the school. But where I've now used this language in the brief is because of the precedent that it created. And so to single out those words, this idea that the prime part of our Constitution is to protect those once ignored or excluded, those ignored or excluded probably by the very people who created that Constitution. In my line of work, this is for trans folks. And this is Black trans folks. This is trans folks with disabilities. There's a lot of intersectionality here. In prisons, in schools, at work, in healthcare, we're arguing that discrimination against trans people is sex discrimination under the Constitution. We're citing Justice Ginsburg's cases. We're winning some of them. This, to me, is the extension of constitutional rights and protections to people once ignored. So I think the beauty of her decisions, which is what I've been most exposed to, but though I love the discussion of all that came before when she was litigating, but these decisions, what a legacy that she's writing the language that's protecting those that she may not herself have envisioned when she wrote that in 1996. And she herself, of course, relied on other precedents in the racial justice context in her decisions. So this is, I guess, a beauty of our rule of law, but also of Justice Ginsburg.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for bringing that up. I want to delve a little bit more deeply into this question of racial justice and intersectionality, because as we know from RBG's sort of rise as an icon, her notorious nickname, it was sort of granted her, and the Tumblr was created after her dissent in Shelby County, which was the case that really gutted the Voting Rights Act, and in that dissent, she wrote, I love this quotation as someone who lives in California, "Just as buildings in California have a greater need to be earthquake-proofed, places where there's greater racial polarization in voting have a greater need for prophylactic measures to prevent purposeful race discrimination." And she also had the famous analogy of you don't throw away an umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, right? That's when you know the umbrella is working. So she had this powerful voice and this powerful legacy. And there have also been commentators who point out some of the justice's blind spots and mixed record in other decisions, in particular around Indigenous rights and immigration. And I couldn't help but notice that And the photos, the beautiful, beautiful photos of the clerks at her, lining the stairs of the Supreme Court before her funeral. There was a really, very gender diverse group, but maybe not a particularly racially diverse group. So, Imani, you had a great article in Rewire in which you talked about Justice Ginsburg's white feminist impulse, but concluded that you loved her anyway. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a bit and just talk about what do you see as her legacy on race and the law, and was her feminism, would you describe it as intersectional, or what are we to make of that?
Well, first of all, I think that's a tough question to answer, right? Because she was a complicated person and she had a very long legacy. When it comes to the number of Black Supreme Court clerks that she hired, I think it's a little bit unfair to hold her to that standard when no one was hiring Black clerks. Now, that doesn't mean that she shouldn't have been hiring Black clerks, but I see a lot of people sort of in the aftermath of her death trying to find reasons to criticize her, and among people who I think are criticizing her in a very bad faith way, saying, well, she should have retired, and I think we're going to get to that later. But they bring up these issues in a really bad faith way, and I find that frustrating because, as you said, the sort of notorious RBG status was sort of bequeathed to her, which oddly by Jewish women. And I'm a Jewish woman. I know Erin Carmon and some other people, so I kind of felt like that was okay because like I'm Black and Jewish and like she's Jewish. I was like, it didn't bother me, but I know that it did bother some other Black people. And so obviously Black people aren't a monolith and I can't speak for all Black people, but that didn't bother me. What did bother me about her more recent history was her comments about Colin Kaepernick, which she, to her credit, she walked back almost immediately, although she didn't explain why she walked them back. And so what I would have liked to see her wrestle with the sort of racial justice issues that we are facing now, and that she was the environment in which she was living later in her life. And, on the one hand, I would have loved for her to be a little bit more quote unquote woke. On the other hand, she was like an 85-year-old white lady. You know what I mean? So it's like, I give her a little bit of, I guess maybe I extend her a little bit of grace because specifically of the grace that she extended to Pauli Murray back in 1970, whatever, when, no one was paying attention to Black women. I mean, people still don't pay attention to Black women in a lot of respects, but certainly, I think you would probably ask any Black woman who's ever worked in any sort of space, corporate space with white people, the frequency with which we are ignored, the frequency with which our ideas are co-opted and then not credited to us. So, she built this gender jurisprudence on the back of jurisprudence that Pauli Murray was already wrestling with respect to racial justice, right? And so she had decided that there was no reason that the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause should apply to race and not to sex. And so the fact that Ginsburg built her gender jurisprudence on that basic concept, and then the fact that she included Pauli Murray's brief, this law review article where she sort of expounded upon this idea, the fact that Ginsburg appended that brief to her brief in Reed v. Reed, that, this is the landmark case where she convinced these 9 white dudes to, I guess they weren't all white. No, they were all white. Yeah. These 9 white dudes convinced them to say, you know what? Gender discrimination really is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And maybe we should, look at gender equality a little bit more closely. But she appended Pauli Murray's brief to that and then put Pauli Murray's name on the brief, along with the name of a leftist white feminist named Dorothy Kenyon. And, I didn't even know about that until recently. And that really it gave me a lot of pause, honestly, because, I work with a woman, Jessica Mason-Piclo, and I remember when we first started partnering together, it was a few years ago, and we were going to write up our first piece together. And when we were deciding who should have the first byline, she said, you should have the first byline. And I said, oh, okay. She said, they're going to think I wrote it anyway. And I thought, that's really an amazing thing for her to have said, because I knew that. And the fact that she knew that and expressed it to me let me know that she was a white woman that I could rely on in a lot of senses. And so I obviously don't know what Pauli Murray was thinking, but the fact that she extended that level of grace to Pauli Murray in a way that I don't think anyone else would have at that time period, and in a way that I don't think a lot of people would now, that meant a lot to me, finding that out 25, 30 years later. It seems that Lisa got kicked out, so maybe I'll just kick that question.
Carry on our own.
Yeah, and with respect to, I did want to touch on some of the Indigenous issues that Lisa did bring up. Honestly, obviously, not obviously, but I'm not Indigenous, and I don't feel comfortable speaking for Indigenous activists and people who had problems with her jurisprudence when it came to Indian law. I do know, the one big case that a lot of Indigenous people cite is the Sherrill case, where, with what I would consider offensive language, she sort of described, sovereignty as sort of this thing of the past, this ancient relic of the past. And I can understand, when you're talking to Native people whose land was stolen from them, that saying tribal sovereignty is not really a thing anymore probably didn't sit well with them, even though the issue in the case was just a simple land purchase and then repurchase, and whether or not the Oneida Nation had to pay taxes on it. So I think that Indigenous activists do have every right to feel whatever way they feel about her. But I do think it's important to recognize that perspective, she did side with tribal sovereignty in other cases later in her life. And I'm thinking specifically of, I think it was one of the cases involving a domestic violence dispute on a reservation. I think it was Bryant something. But she sided with tribal sovereignty against a criminal defendant. And it turned out to be this case about tribal sovereignty versus individual rights, right? The individual rights of like a red-blooded American. And she sided with tribal sovereignty. So, and upon her death, I made sure to go to Indian country and to go to a lot of these, to go and look at what leaders in the Native community were saying, and they were mixed. And so I feel okay myself feeling mixed about her legacy overall, but really just being grateful for the person that she was.
Yeah, I appreciate that and all the context that you're adding. Anyone else want to go in before we move on?
I just add to the kind of the racial justice piece. This might be more of a footnote, but some of the work that I've done in the world of death penalty abolition. So right now, Black Lives Matters, I think quite rightly, calls for the end of the death penalty, the abolition of the death penalty. And the history of the death penalty is rife with explicit racism. When you go onto Wikipedia, the map of our death penalty states, and this is not hyperbole, it looks like a map of the Confederacy. So folks much more knowledgeable than I have written on the topic, but she was one of these folks one of two. She joined Justice Breyer's dissent in a case called Glossop v. Gross. And the last sentence of that dissent that Justice Breyer wrote says something effective: it is quite possible that the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment, that it is itself cruel and unusual, not because it's young people or because it's people with intellectual disability. No, just the whole thing is unconstitutional. Interestingly, Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor did not. I think more for strategic reasons, but we have two justices. Both Ginsburg and Breyer. I give her a lot of credit for that. I have to think, because it is explicit in that dissent, the racially disparate impact this has on Black folks. That was, I think, an important contribution, not only to kind of the death penalty abolition effort, but to racial justice.
And perhaps to just add on the sovereignty side, she was great among other justices in trying to push back against what is currently the majority rule about state sovereignty and its immunity under the 11th Amendment. So the challenge of the function of sovereignty in the court's jurisprudence and how you can understand the terms of tribal identity and distinctiveness and obligation and exclusion, and figure out a way to do it without the other sovereignty being triggered is, I think, part of the walking on the criminal justice front. In recent years, she's joined Justice Sotomayor in several powerful, moving, painful dissents on Fourth Amendment, stop and frisk kinds of issues. So I think in all of these, I guess almost everyone who was close to her was aware of how she tried incredibly carefully to choose words, both spoken and on paper, and line edited and line edited and line edited. And so in that effort, it's wonderful to hear over this hour people quoting from words, because they weren't off the cuff. They were really chosen.
That in and of itself is a lovely legacy. I want to pick up on something, Imani, that you mentioned about this potentially kind of disingenuous critique that we hear now that Justice Ginsburg should have left the court in 2014. And there was a front page article, I think, in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago describing this lunch between President Obama and the justice. And I'm curious what you all make of this. It has struck me as well as, a kind of strange question to be asking, that maybe she should have foretold the future and known, all of McConnell's tactics, known that, that 2016 election would have gone the way it did. But what do you all make of that? What's your take? Imani, if you want to kick us off, because you brought it up, and then we can go around.
I think it's, pardon my French, utter bullshit. The notion that a bunch of guys took this woman out to lunch, the second woman on the court, who, by the way, was very aware of the fact that when Sandra Day O'Connor retired to take care of her husband, she later regretted it, right? She later regretted sort of, I guess, giving into that sort of domestic side to take care of her husband. So this idea that a bunch of guys took this woman out to lunch and said, hey, Ruth, maybe it's time you retired. And I remember at the end of the Times article, I don't know who was quoted as saying they might have been better off with Breyer. And in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, why didn't you take the white guy out to lunch and ask him to retire? Because, if you take into account lifespan between white men and white women, it's about the same. Like, he's 4 years younger than her? So, there's that aspect of it. This sort of like pushing out this woman because you think she's too old to work anymore. And then secondly, I think given who she was and the legacy that she built over her career, I would imagine that she would have wanted to leave that legacy to someone who was going to uphold it. And that someone is not Amy Coney Barrett, that's for sure. Now, when it comes to saying she should have retired, as you said, you are asking her to do something that none of us did, which was predict that this carnival barker was going to end up in the White House. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous for people to try and retroactively say that she should have retired when, and the people who say this, my first instinct is to ask to see what their voting record has been. Because quite frankly, if you didn't vote in the midterms and if you didn't vote in the election to give Obama the Senate that he would have needed to replace her with someone good, or if you didn't, vote to give Hillary Clinton the presidency so that she could have replaced Ginsburg with someone better than Barrett, then I really don't want to hear from you because you didn't do your job, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked until she literally died. Imagine working until you expire. And so then now our people are coming back and saying, oh, well, she should have done this and should have done that. When she worked not for herself, it wasn't ego. I see people saying that, oh, well, it was just an ego trip. This wasn't ego. This was her trying to leave a better world for people. And I don't think that she would have thought leaving a better world would have meant being replaced by like a white centrist, which I honestly think if she would have retired in 2014, Obama had already appointed Kagan, had already appointed Sonia Sotomayor. I don't think that Senate was going to give him another liberal female justice. It would have been a Merrick Garland centrist type. So I don't think it's reasonable for people to expect her to be a fortune teller and then also to just scoot aside on the say-so of a bunch of men to be replaced by a man who didn't hold the same values as her.
Cindy, Kevin, Judith, any dissenting views or anything to add?
Well, first of all, that was just wonderfully said. And the only small addition is, having been a person in many rooms where I'm the only woman or only one, the other was her contribution to Justices Kagan and Sotomayor by being inside that room and being there. And so I also think, as she would have known better than all of us, how being the only, and talked about how hard it was to be the only woman in the room, to appreciate that. And she used to talk about, it would all, the bench was hardly parity in her lifetime. So that I think that's another facet of the contribution that has already been laid out in extremely clear and poignant terms.
If I could just jump in again, I think that's a really, really salient point. Particularly, I made that point on Twitter, and it was remarkable how many people just came at me saying that I was being like paternalistic, I guess maternalistic. Like, how dare you say that Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan would have needed a mentor? And it came into stark relief that men just operate in a different way than women do. And I don't know, maybe Kevin can speak to this, but it just seemed to me that mentor each other in ways where they don't even really know that that's what they're doing, right? They have these boys clubs that they go to, they go smoke cigars at bars, they go on the golf course. I remember my third year in law school, I learned how to play golf just so that I would be able to go on a golf course with all of these white guys I was surrounded by and not feel like a complete idiot. So, I think that this idea of mentorship, this idea that Ginsburg would have left the bench as soon as these two women were coming on the bench, I just think that's a really weird thing to expect her to do. And I think it's really weird to say that I am somehow, I was even accused of, it was saying it was racist to say that Ginsburg would have needed to help Sonia Sotomayor. I was just like, what are you talking about? Women mentor each other all the time, especially in the legal profession. I didn't have a really great mentor in my years of practice. I would have loved one, not because I wasn't competent or I needed help, but because I needed someone to commiserate with about the culture of law firms, just in the way that I would have thought that Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan would have wanted to know about the culture of the court, how things work. Where's the Coke machine? Where's the bathroom? Just basic stuff. So,
yeah, and if I can just add, and I think that there was something really wonderful, when there were three women on the court, and I went to, and I encourage people to listen to. I just recently, I was at the oral argument for Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt, but I encourage people to read that. To listen to it, and then to listen to, Harris versus Mcrae when Rhonda Copeland argued that. And it was the dynamics were so different, and part of the really important thing in that case was there were these health regulations, which were really sham regulations, right? That really were not about protecting women's health, and Texas claimed that they did. And all these assertions were made about the nature of the procedure, what abortion is, sort of all this innuendo and, vague things about, stigmatizing abortion and sort of claiming that it was dangerous. And just one by one, just this idea of having women on the court who could talk about, well, isn't this the same as a DNC? What is this procedure really like, right? And that never would have happened if you didn't have three women in the room, like, who were familiar with the procedure, who could bring women's experiences into it, and were truth tellers, right? Because they were going to say that there was some ridiculous health reason. And, I think a lot of the male justices would just go along and sort of say, well, there must be some reason, when in fact it really didn't make sense. And if you understood the way the procedure actually works, and you understood women's reality in terms of the ability to get to clinics, it just made so much difference having those three women in the room.
Yeah, Cindy, I'm so happy you brought up Whole Woman's Health. That was actually that was the case that launched SCOTUS Theater, because we were talking about the arguments. And of course, then we thought, we should just do this as a fundraiser and realize this. But, there was also, Justice Ginsburg were so instrumental in also demolishing the nonsensical question of standing that started that argument. So yeah, it is a great one to read. So because we've sort of touched on this a little bit, I do want to go a little bit more into the kind of structure of the court and the future of the court, and not talk too much about Justice Barrett, but I think would be remiss to not mention her. I was very struck in the confirmation hearing how how little Justice Barrett said. And I think it really just, there's such a host of questions about what happens to the court now. Are these confirmation hearings useful? Is it too politicized? Should the structure be reformed? Should we have more justices? And there's a similar question in the chat about, what can lay people do to change the legal system, change SCOTUS? So, Judith, I'll lead off with you because I know this is a topic of great expertise of yours. Where do we go from here with the court, and what are the reforms that may be needed?
You want me to?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So first of all, quickly, I have a CNN op-ed that lays out some of this, but quickly, first of all, confirmation hearings are important to tell us what we're fighting about. So before we say, just don't look at what's answered, look at what's asked. And I wrote once a lengthy article mapping, when did women come on the screen? Thank you, Patsy Mink from Hawaii and Betty Friedan, who in a nomination in the early 70s said, hello, what is this person's views toward women? And after that, every just perspective was asked something, but it only mattered. Proposed Justice Robert Bork said that the 14th Amendment didn't apply to women because of his originalism, which it wasn't meant to apply to women of all colors. And it mattered in his hearing when his views about race and gender intersected with others in terms of a Senate coming together to say this isn't an appropriate person for the court. So I wouldn't so much diss confirmation hearings as figure out how to fix the court. And in terms of that, it would be great if there was less of a focus on, there's nothing written stone, i.e. in the Constitution, even if the Constitution, which is not stone, but as we see, can be quite reinterpreted. But 9 people is not a requirement. And the numbers have changed. There's a great op-ed out by a woman historian from Columbia about the changing numbers. Quickly, if you have 15 or 11 and they sit in panels where you no longer have a fixed set of people always saying the same thing to each other, and moreover, you have a question in which the court's docket is not of its own selection, but is selected by a group of lower court judges, with some exceptions, pushing cases up to them, and you have them take many more cases, you've really made major changes. So the fast answer is, the problem is to change the numbers on the court, the way the court sits, and the way the court gets its docket.
Yeah, I believe it was a Yale law student maybe who even authored that op-ed. Any other thoughts from the group? I see Cindy, you've unmuted.
No, I'm just
discussing.
I thought that was great, Judith.
Imani or Kevin, any thoughts? Yeah.
I mean, I think so. I did a event for a Rewire News Group with Elie Mystal, who's at The Nation, and he's on MSNBC, and he's just like hilarious and brilliant. And he turned me into an evangelist for his idea, which is that we need probably like 30 Supreme Court justices, because as he points out, the problem with the current slate of justices is that you've got 6 people who all think the same way, because they're all in some way or another either handpicked by the Federalist Society, which is this like looming group of conservative libertarians who have essentially taken over the entire judiciary and just installed just some of the most incompetent people you could possibly want to be deciding cases. So you've got 6 people who all think the same. So if one person writes a decision, there's no real discussion of the ideas in the case. There's no discussion of the case law. It's just, yeah, that looks good 4 times over, or 5 extra times. And then you've got 3 sort of quasi-independent judges who will sometimes cross the aisle and vote with the conservatives, but you're really not going to see a whole lot of conservatives, I think, crossing the aisle to vote with the liberals. And if we're looking at Roberts and Gorsuch as being our swing votes, we've already lost on a lot of the social justice issues that I care about, certainly. So, I think what needs to happen is we need to go back to a time where there was just a diversity of thought. And I don't even know we're going back to a time. We've never really had that time. We need to move to a time where there's diversity of thought, so that there's not always going to be the rights of people, same-sex marriage, voting rights, abortion rights, environmental justice, climate change. All those rights shouldn't sit on whether or not John Roberts has a good lunch or whether or not Neil Gorsuch had a good night's sleep. There should just be more people discussing these rights that actually affect human beings. I mean, by next June, we might not have a healthcare bill because one person has just been installed on the court to gut the healthcare bill. And I think that that's not the way democracy is supposed to work. It can't be the way that this country is supposed to work.
Right. And, actually, maybe just to sort of underscore something, I think that you're both, that comes out of both your remarks is just, if we had more justices on the court, theoretically, we could have a court that looks more like the country, right, in terms of thinking about getting diverse views. And I mean, it also relates to how people are nominated, but if you had more people, theoretically, there would be more diversity and there would be a broader range of expertise and experiences.
Yeah, I mean,
the key is to change the stakes so that the stakes issue, which goes to the courts of appeals and the life tenure judiciary in general, is that if you had people tenured to the bench but not to a particular slot, they can also sit by designation as a term of art. But in addition, and Justice Souter does sit sometimes on the First Circuit has. So if you change the length of time, if you have more of a sense of movement, you also have more of a sense of a conversation required because people are not only talking to each other again and less siloing. And then if you also had more, and you also, one of the things to flag is that federal judiciary has an equal number at the trial level of people called magistrate and bankruptcy judges as the number of life tenure judges. So actually we need more judges. It's not that we have all the judges. There's a huge human need for conflict resolution. And so having more also lowers the stakes because there's not just one fixed view and people won't be able to have as much energy to handpick, we hope, but to think about picking people, not because of their ideological pre-commitments, but because they're wise, kind, generous people. And one of the criteria that isn't mentioned at all is where did you give away time? Who did you help? How did you as a lawyer help people do things in the world who, in this world of lack of access to legal services, need so much help?
And I did not want to have the last word on this, and I'm not a scholar in the area. I really appreciate those views. And thank you, Judith, for that. I think, and Cindy, kind of you put your thumb on it. I think we need a court that looks a lot less like me. I think in this day and age, and so maybe if we get rid of these high stakes, that's how we get there. But my concern, and I haven't read this yet, and I don't read a lot in the area, and I need to, but it's, for lack of a better word, white minority rule. When we have people on the court who look like I do, but embody ideological commitments that I do not, dressed up in words like textualist or originalist, I think these decisions are going to have negative consequences for the people who are ignored that Justice Ginsburg talked about. And the people are going to be looking to the court as the branch that's there to help. And they're going to see not themselves. So I think this is a really, really important issue. And I'm going to be really interested in the folks who do a lot of thinking here.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to close this out because I realize that we're around time, and I find myself very moved, Judith, by what you said about that. What we need to be asking is, how have people spent their time? Where have they given their time? And who did you help? I wrote that down. I just really, it really affected me. And so I want to just close us out in thinking about the legacy of Justice Ginsburg in those terms. Like, what will Justice Ginsburg's lasting legacy be, and who did she help, or how did she help us moving forward? What should we take from this discussion today, and more broadly from her legacy? And I'll just go around in the order that I see folks, and I'll start with Cindy. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, obviously, she's going to be recognized as the architect, or with Pauli Murray and others of constitutional protections prohibiting gender discrimination, right? But I think that, and it was so wonderful actually to hear from Judith about what Justice Ginsburg was like as a person, because I think that really, it makes her cases make more sense, right? In terms of just thinking about how the law really impacted people, right? And I think when we sort of see these textualists and these originalists, they're just sort of interested in the law in the abstract. And I think like one of the beautiful things about Justice Ginsburg is her really caring about how the law is really going to impact people, and the reality of how it affects people's lives. And so I feel like that's her legacy.
Yeah. Oh, Imani, you're muted.
If I could go next before I forget, because I have ADD and I'll forget.
You go right away.
I gotta get this out. I'm already starting to forget. To sort of tack onto what Cindy said, I really like the fact that she thought about people, right? And going back to, I think what you said in the affirmative action cases, what really bothers me about the affirmative action jurisprudence is this sort of lie that we tell ourselves that we're not supposed to be giving reparations to Black people for slavery. And so with affirmative action, the jurisprudence has moved into this sort of, oh, we care about diversity and we can't have quotas, but maybe we should do this and then the other thing. And the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was like, no, what is the context of this, right? We're looking at this because we did some really messed up shit to Black people. And so it's kind of upon us to make sure that people who started, on the 1st-yard line can catch up to the people who started on the 50-yard line. And so I think that that's really important. And I think the level of her dissent, I have a desk plaque that my best friend from law school got me that says, do all things with the confidence of Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissenting. And I think her level of dissent, I think Sonia Sotomayor is going to carry that legacy forward. And I think that that's what kind of keeps me going, because I'm going to be covering the sort of downfall of reproductive rights in this country. And what keeps me going is knowing that, I can just skip to the end and find Sonia's opinion and read that first to sort of ground me in what's right. And the law is supposed to help people. It's not supposed to be looked through this magnifying glass of what did these white guys in tights and wigs think in 1770, whatever. As a Black woman, I don't care. I literally do not care. And so it baffles me that Clarence Thomas seems to care so much, but that's another discussion. So I guess I would say like her legacy, I think, has taught a lot of young women to just dissent, to stand up and say, I demand to be heard. I'm not going to be ignored. I have things to say. You will listen to me. And I might wear a dainty little collar while doing it.
It is truly helpful to have a catchphrase like dissent. And as you know, I'm a Sotomayor stan, so I appreciate you bringing her in. Kevin and then Judith.
Yeah. So I guess just real quickly, when I think of Justice Ginsburg, and I probably alluded to this before, but I see her decisions as opening, as providing access, opening doors. I mean, in a literal sense of allowing women into this military school where Virginia did not want them, or opening up, finding those words in the Constitution to protect reproductive rights, to protect trans folks, to protect the LGBTQ community and others. That's what I see as her legacy. And hopefully we'll see more of it in time and in scholars and folks who are on the bench.
It's great to be part of a group who all are able to catch so many facets of a remarkable person. I think what has always stood out for me is that she was helping all of us not be locked into conventional expectations. So stereotyping may be kind of a shorthand, but it was that whatever was expected, think for yourself about what it is you want to do. And in Kevin's phrase about opening the door, not being precluded because of an assumption that history has put you into some other place. And she actually lived it herself. And so she enables us both to see in the material physical person, a person who was able to do that, but also to see that she was able to help others see that that was better for the world if we weren't all locked into boxes into which people thought had to be because of our gender, race, ethnicity, age, and the like. And she was a great getting good at getting older. I have a friend named Laura Geller who's just written a book about that. And it's called this idea that she was a model in each iteration for alternative and many ways to be. And so I think we all have to be thinking we're lucky to have had glimpses of that.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate this summary, and I really appreciate all of you. It was so interesting and so enjoyable to hear all of your different perspectives, and I appreciate that you made the time and shared your expertise. I want to close us out with a quotation from Justice Ginsburg that I was thinking about. We had a question in the chat about, will there be a time where we don't just look to the Constitution of 250 years ago? Will there be a time where we're not obsessed with the founders? And I'm going to paraphrase because I didn't memorize it, but the Justice Ginsburg wrote something about that dissents speak to a future age, that you're not just writing about something that's wrong, but that, dissents can become the majority opinion, dissents can become, can really become the law. And I think that, it's been a challenging time for many. It's been a challenging week for people who care about the court, and that kind of hopeful note that dissents often point us to the future, I think is just something really helpful to keep in mind, not only when we think about Justice Ginsburg, but about the work that we all do. So again, a huge thanks to the four of you scholars and thinkers for sharing your time. And thank you to Long Wharf for having us all. Good night.
Thank you.